Look at the Philippines GDP. It's already $500 billion. It grew at 7.6%. So you just do the basic math. If it keeps on growing at around 6%, within a decade, it's going to be $1 trillion economy. It's already in the top 40 economies in the world, but we're hoping to make it the top 20 economies uh, before the middle of the century. And the other thing with the Philippines is it has a very young population, which you don't have here in Europe, right? You're an aging society. But in the Philippines, the median age is in the mid 20s. So even if the Philippines doesn't have high quality growth, it can still grow. But we want to make it also high quality growth, not just growth for the sake of growth, but high quality growth. I think that's where there's perfect complementarity. Geopolitically speaking, the Philippines is also building up its armed forces, right? Spending billions of dollars on its neglected armed forces for a very long time. But also geopolitically, we are revitalizing our ties with the US in ways that makes us very important to the future of a free and open Indo-Pacific. In particular, the Philippines just decided to open up a big bases to Americans close to the South China Sea, close to Taiwan. So all of that is going to influence what China is going to do next, right? So that is why the Philippines geopolitically is also very important. But this is not happening because the Philippines is just luckily in the right place. It's also happening because there's a conscious choice by the Philippine government to make the most out of the new environment we have. Historians call it polycrisis, right? Multiple crises happening, but the crisis always create opportunity if you got the guts. So I'm not a fan of the former Philippine President Duterte. You know why? You can guess why. But I think he did shake up the system. He made the Philippines rethink its place in the world, rethink its democratic values. And I think that's why even if another Marcos is now the president, the Philippines is actually moving in the right direction, at least on the strategic and foreign policy front. If you look at it in ASEAN, the Philippines is the least dependent country on China. For if you look at it, much of our trade actually, yes, China plus Hong Kong will be our top. But if you look at the whole landscape, Philippines trade with Japan is huge. Japan has been our number one export partner for a long time. They're our number one infrastructure investment partner and number one source of ODA. But Europe is also in the mix. US is also in the mix. So if you look at it, a lot of ASEAN countries, China alone dominates a huge part of their trade and investment picture. That's not the case of Philippines. China may be number one together with Hong Kong, but it's still a relatively small part of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is Europe, Japan, US, traditional partners playing a very important role, not to mention South Korea and India also coming in. So in that sense, the Philippines is structurally less dependent on China. And that, I think, gives us a sense of confidence that, we can ruffle the feathers with China and go stronger with our Western allies than many other ASEAN countries, right? Who are much more dependent. But the other thing is, as I said, the demographic dynamics in the Philippines, young population, coming from a low base, not to mention the boom in the services industry. The Philippines actually has the biggest business process outsourcing on earth, bigger than India's. And a lot of Silicon Valley companies, Google among others, are moving their coding backup systems to Manila. The Philippines also has a booming fintech industry. A lot of startups are coming out of nowhere because pandemic really unleashed this creative energy in the digital economy. So you have suddenly out of nowhere in the past 3 years, some very young people in the Philippines suddenly becoming millionaires and potentially, I don't know, dollars, no, billionaires in the coming years because we are tapping into markets that were not tapped by conventional credit system, by conventional financial system. So suddenly the Philippines is having these domestic generators of growth and at the same time robust enough trade with Japan and other countries that even when China slowed down last year significantly, growing barely 4 or 5%, if we're to believe their numbers, probably is even lower, 3%, we still grow at 7.6%. So our challenge is to keep growth at 5 to 6% in the next 5 years and make it more and more inclusive, right? I think that's doable if we play our cards and dealing with our friends in Europe, getting the necessary technology, regulatory thinking, and also the kind of values, competitive market values is very, very important because the problem for the Philippines is that very few families have been controlling the economy and the politics for too long. Yeah, I'm still working on a book right now. For me, the future does not have to be necessarily defined by either of those two superpowers, right? Because we consistently see that these superpowers also have their limits. I'm not underestimating their influence in the region because if you look at quantitative surveys like the Low Institute Power Index, clearly clearly China and US are far above everyone else. Quantitatively, obviously US and China are really at top. But if you put the numbers of number 3, 4, and 5, India, Japan, Korea, Indonesia together, it's bigger than each of the superpowers. What does it mean? It means that actually the future does not have to inevitably be defined by either of these superpowers. And remember, both of these superpowers have serious internal problems. We see the slowdown in China, the demographic winter in China, and US, que horror, with their politics. So I think if Indonesia, Europe, India, South Korea, rising Philippines, Vietnam, they get their act together. I call it middle power diplomacy. We can collectively make sure that we hold these superpowers to account. Because there are times that when the US is a problem and headache for us, we clearly saw that with Trump, right? So as much as America shares our values on so many levels, there are times that America is the problem too, right? So we really have to get our act together. So I believe in middle power diplomacy and I believe in mini-lateral diplomacy. Mini meaning working on areas where we have shared interest in an ad hoc, flexible way. So Quad, for instance, is the best example of mini-lateral cooperation, but it's purely on security. We need more mini-lateral cooperation on technical issues, rule of law issues, on economic issues. So this is, I think, the future, what we have to look at. So yes, ASEAN is important, EU is important, sure, UN is important, but multilateralism clearly has its limits. So I think mini-lateral cooperation, to say Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, with EU working together, because they share many common values. We're not exactly at the same level, political, economical, but we have a lot of values. So if we work together more and more and better, I'm more optimistic that we can check the worst instincts of any superpowers. So the battle for hegemony of the future could be actually in favor of the middle powers. So the future could be completely multipolar in the best way possible. Not the Chinese version of multipolar, because the Chinese or Russian version of multipolar is this. You have your Americas, we have our Asia, Russia will have Eastern Europe. No, not that kind of multipolar. A truly competitive and inclusive order. That's what we want. Clearly, we are in the new Cold War. I mean, in fact, I would argue this is the real Cold War because Russia, so-called Soviet Union, I think was never really in position to compete with the West. I mean, Soviet Union never had the size of the economy. It had a big military, but never the kind of civilian economy and resources to compete with the West. China is much closer to a peer rival, to the United States. But that is why the United States is saying it shouldn't be me versus China. It should be about a free and open order. So anyone who shares that value should come and help me. So the most interesting case is India. So clearly India is not helpful when it comes to Ukraine, right? They're clearly leveraging that to get the best out of Russia. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, India is more on our side, meaning those who believe that this region should not be dominated by China and its authoritarian system. So if you look at it, even the swing state, fence-sitters, are much closer to America's conception of what the region should look like than, of course, the situation we're seeing Russia. So what does it mean? That means that even if inevitably US is going to have relative decline in terms of share of GDP, share of trade, it's just going to happen because everyone is rising finally. US values, US architecture, security architecture can be implemented by other countries who share those values. So in short, you can have a post-American world without America no longer the dominant, but still a liberal international order or free and open order. And that's why EU is very important. We have been extremely encouraged with our friends in Spain, in France, in UK and Germany for their Indo-Pacific policy because everyone's realizing that's the future. Now, obviously, Europe is not in a position to match what US can offer militarily or China and Japan can offer economically. But just Europe's presence alone, its emphasis on the rule of law, on international law, especially in the South China, that's very important for us because it makes it clear that this is not just US and China. This is about the future of the international community. This is about future of a free and open order, right? So I think that's where this is very important to me. But I believe there's a lot of room for actual expansion in military presence of the European countries, but also economic presence. And more than that, I think Europe can do a lot in terms of capacity building. So let me give you an example. So for instance, the Philippines is now in 5G, right? We're using a lot of Chinese technology, Huawei ZTE, and we're going to move to 6G soon. Things are moving very fast because of the digital economy. Now, the reality is that those new technologies have new risk factor to them, right? Including accusation it may give backdoor access to China. Now, I think this is where we can get a lot of regulatory and technical assistance from Europe on how to make sure we can protect our critical infrastructure from infiltration or sabotage by other powers. So while I don't believe it's doable for the Philippines, to say no to anything from China, I think it's doable for us to get some investments from China, but to be able to check it to assistance. So in short, kind of like Reagan, trust but verify. Get investment in, but make sure you verify that this investment is not really undermining our national security. Now, obviously, there are other sectors where you don't want any investment from China because it could have very serious repercussions. For instance, in media sector, I'm not sure you want China there, right? They use sharp power, right? They infiltrate. We know that. I was based in Taiwan for quite some time, so I've been following this Chinese sharp power for quite some time. In the same way, you guys are very worried with Russian disinformation and all. But there are sectors where China inevitably will come in because they have the best to offer, right? So we cannot just say no to that because that will hold us back. But I think we can get technical assistance. We can get the regulatory advice from our friends in Europe, including Spain, on better dealing with China. I think this is a very important thing.